Hello. I've got here a conference called the CUSP Conference, Canadian Unity, Sovereignty, and Prosperity Conference, that actually happened back in November 30th, December 1st of 2002. This is while the Liberals and Jean Chrétien was in power. If we could only be back in that day, right? So this is 2023, pardon me. And, Bill C-11's coming around, and I just thought it's time to get this stuff online. My name's Kevin Peck, and I helped with this, Paul Hellyer, with this conference back in the day. Yeah. So, this is basically what it's about. It was a citizens-led organized conference, various political spectrum. We got the Conservatives, NDP. We even got Elizabeth May in here representing Green Party and NDP, right? And we're talking about social issues of the day. And they haven't changed much. They've just gotten a lot worse. Okay, so it's a little bit xenophobic, some of the language. Paul Hellyer was a hardcore, and he did not believe in free trade as it was executed. I mean, there is nothing wrong with free trade. Trade is good, but the free trade agreement in Canada was not about trade. It was about free capital. That is, benefits for and mechanisms to allow global corporations to exist and separate the capital from the people, the workers. So. And also create a financial structure that is not constrained by the policy of governments and different legislative bodies, right? So that's kind of thing. And 20 years later, we've kind of got what we got now with the WHO, WEF, and all that other stuff. So yeah, so let's dig into what we got here. I'm not gonna release them all at once. There's 2 days of it, hours of material, but I'm gonna just follow the schedule. And I'll first give you a quick look at who's in this. The people behind it. Well, actually, here, let me pull this out. This is the short list of the people that met regularly to make this happen. This is kind of internal memos here. Just, with our agenda and the planning group with the core people here. We got Doris Anderson, bless her soul, the late Doris Anderson, Alan Redway, Paul Hellyer, Ian Hudson, Patrick Boyer, John Ostrom, myself, Walter Pittman. He did show up. It says unconfirmed here. Peter Block Hansen, Sidney Pinches, Shannon Doyle, Wendy Lamb, who I worked with lots in the office, Paul's office of the Canadian Action Party, which you probably never heard of, but it was one of Paul Hellyer's post-retirement activities. He just never gave up with public service. That's just what he lived for. So, all right. So speakers, we got Patrick Boyer, Jim Stanford, Mel Hurtig. He's going to be the first one I'm going to upload. Michael Shalsadovsky, Murray Dobbin, Wendy Holm, of course, Paul Hellyer. He speaks last, although he does do the introduction. John Godfrey, Don Lidstone, pardon me, Linda McQuaig, and of course Elizabeth May. You have to make adjustments for Elizabeth May. She wasn't quite as ridiculous as she is today. And we have some interesting panels. The panels were good. There was a lot of back and forth discussion, and the audience participated a lot in the QAs, and that's some of the most enjoyable parts of the conference. Just the level of engagement and knowledge with the audience was heartwarming at the time. So we've got issues over healthcare, agriculture, electoral reform, which was something, actually. That's what Doris Anderson introduced me to, electoral reform and Fair Vote Canada. And what else we got? Monetary sovereignty, of course, that's another one of Paul Hellier's big issues, and he's brought in Jordan Grant to talk about that, or to chair that at least, who's Ann Emmett and Herb Wiseman are speaking about it. All right, so, yes, 20 years ago. I have to go by what was listed here. All right, so what else can I say about it? Well, I'm going to add more commentary just to set the context for each of the speakers as they come, and I'll present to you the schedule here. So we're going to do Mel Hurtig, then John Godfrey, and Dennis Kucinich. Some of these people are still active today. Dennis Kucinich is going to be at a peace march in a couple of days. He was the keynote speaker, and he let's see. So basically, when this conference happened at the Metro Toronto Convention Center, right across from the CBC main building for CBC English Canada, and they ghosted the entire event. I mean, these are all headline people involved here, and there are, in different ways, they were making impressions in the public on their own. And they were all together here, and the conference was ghosted by CBC. But Dennis Kucinich, they did invite him to come across the street to their studios, and then they did an interview with him there. He was, he's an international figure. He couldn't really be ignored, I suppose. But he ignored the rest of the conference. But no one's going to deny this isn't Canadian content here. So we're going to upload this before C11's in effect, and we'll see what happens. And I'm looking forward to the discussions on YouTube, and we'll see what other platforms I put it on. And so enjoy.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce an old friend and someone who has earned the title of Canada's Premier Patriot, Mel Hurtig. Mel Hurtig, Officer of Canada, was raised in Edmonton and was owner of Hurtig's Books, one of the country's top bookstores. And in his time as arguably the most Canadian publisher outside Toronto, the foremost Canadian publisher outside Toronto. Although he comes across as a man with no inner life, he has some good anecdotes about the travails and joys of bookselling and publishing. That's something I can share, Mel. He has honorary degrees awarded by 6 Canadian universities. Among many other awards and honors, the Lester B. Pearson Man of the Year Peace Award, the Speaker of the Year Award, the Royal Society of Canada's Centenary Medal, and on 2 occasions, the Canadian Book Publisher of the Year Award. He has been chairman of the board of Canadian Booksellers Association, the national chairman of the Committee for an Independent Canada, and is the founder and former chairman of the Council of Canadians. Mr. Hurtig also founded and published the Canadian Encyclopedia. He is the author of several best-selling books, including The Betrayal of Canada, Pay the Rent or Feed the Kids, and his autobiography, At Twilight in the Country. His latest book, The Vanishing Country, was published in October this year and has been a bestseller since it first came on the market. With Mr. Hurtig's flair for writing and public speaking, combined with his knowledge, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mel Hurtig.
Okay, first of all, I would like to congratulate Paul Hellyer and Doris and Patrick and David for putting this conference together. We're at an extraordinarily crucial time in Canadian history. They recognize that. They're doing something about it. Let's give them a big hand. Okay, a quick little bit of history. Back in 1971, some of us went to see Pierre Trudeau. We were part of the Committee for an Independent Canada. Walter Gordon was there. Flora MacDonald, who, when I became the chairman of the Committee for an Independent Canada, was my executive director. And of course, as you know, Flora went on to become Canada's Minister of External Affairs. Jack McClelland was there. Keith Davey was there. And we took to Pierre Trudeau a petition of 176,000 names saying, Mr. Trudeau, if you care about our country, you've got to do something about the extraordinary growth of foreign ownership and foreign control in our country. Foreign ownership and foreign control was going up on a graph at a 45-degree angle, and it took a lot of convincing, but after a while, after a lot of pressure, the best we could do, the Trudeau government brought in the Foreign Investment Review Agency. Now, when they brought in FIRA, the degree of foreign ownership and control, the degree of revenue was about 38% of all of corporate revenue was going to non-Canadians. After a few years, instead of the graph going up on an angle like this, it started to go down on an angle like this, and it dropped all the way down to about 25%. And at that time, in 1981, we folded up the Committee for an Independent Canada, and we thought, well, the job was done. Now, it had dropped down to 25%, and ladies and gentlemen, that figure was still far more than any other developed nation anywhere in the world that you can think of. Somebody named Brian Mulroney got elected in October of 1984. I went on vacation in November, and I had been working very hard on the Canadian Encyclopedia, which, by the way, if you don't mind me mentioning, is now available free of charge to everyone in the world on the internet and updated on a regular basis. Anyway, I told my secretary, look, I'm really bushed and I'd like a little holiday, and would you please try not to disturb me? And instead she kept phoning me. Mel, we're getting all these phone calls and all these letters from people across the country. They're really worried about where this Mulroney guy is going to take us. Remember, Brian Mulroney was the guy in 1983 who said, you'll hear nothing from me about free trade now or at any other time in the future, he said in 1983. Anyway, by the time I got back from vacation, we were thinking about it a little bit. I called a little meeting in my office in January, and we had 11 people in my office on January the 11th, and I said to them, do we really have to go through the whole Committee for an Independent Canada business all over again and start all over again? You know, church basements and auditoriums and universities and colleges and Rotary clubs and buses across the country and the rest of it. And they said, yes, we do. And I said, great, tell me where we're going to get the money, and nobody had any idea. We came to Toronto and had the second meeting to ask the same question the next month. In February, we had a ton of really good people there. Suzuki was there, and Peter Newman was there, and Bob White was there, and et cetera, about 75 people. They came to the same conclusion that it was essential that we started a new organization, and that was really the birth then of the Council of Canadians. And we went on to Maud Barlow in Ottawa, and as you know, Maud has done a fantastic job with the Council of Canadians. But I will tell you something interesting. At that meeting in Toronto, there was only one person who came who wasn't invited. And he phoned me from Montreal and he said, do you mind if I come to the meeting? I said, no, not at all. Please come to the meeting. And after the meeting, where we heard passionate pleas for Canadian independence from Walter Gordon and an aged Walter Gordon, a rather weak Walter Gordon at the time, this gentleman and I met in my room for an hour. We sat eyeball to eyeball for an hour. And at the end of the meeting, I said to him, I really have to tell you, I do not think that this organization is for you. Now, that person was Paul Martin. In 1985, Brian Mulroney axed FIRA, and today, foreign ownership and foreign revenue corporate revenue in Canada is back up to 33%. Of the top 500 companies in Canada, 36% are now foreign-owned and controlled. And in Canada, there are now 35 different industries that are now foreign-owned and controlled. Most of the manufacturing industry, most of the petroleum industry, the chemical industry, the rubber industry, the mineral fuels industry, the electrical apparatus industry, and the list goes on and on. Now, any time I write a letter to the Globe Mail or whoever, or write an article on the subject, the radical right in Canada comes back and says, oh, well, Canadians are buying up the United States. And you get the nonsense reports of this Toronto company called Crosby and Company, and you get Tom DeQuino with his nonsense and the rest of it. Well, look, we have 35 sectors of the Canadian economy, foreign-owned and controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, in the United States, there isn't one, not one. About 6% of American industry is foreign-owned and controlled, and of that 6%, about 8% is owned and controlled by Canadians. Since Mulroney dumped the Foreign Investment Review Agency, 10,300 companies in Canada have been taken over by non-residents, and most of that, about 65%, has been by Americans. And coincidentally, by the way, not only would no other country allow what we've been allowing, but no other country would allow the fact that about 65% of the takeover of Canadian business has been funded by our good old patriotic Canadian banks and other financial institutions. So we're not only selling our country, we're also putting up your savings, the savings of Canadians across our country. So the Montreal Canadiens get bought up by an American, and of course it's a Canadian bank, and the Case and others who put up the money. Teleglobe gets bought up by non-Canadians, and again, it's Canadian banks that put up the money. So I defy anyone here to have a look at my book, The Vanishing Country, and look at, I think it's page 13, and look at 1 month's takeovers. I just show one single month's takeovers and not get sick to your stomach, because it is absolutely sickening what has been happening. Now, in the 17 years that since Mulroney abolished the Foreign Investment Review Agency, the Mickey Mouse Agency Industry Canada has, called the Investment Review Division, has monitored $497 billion worth of foreign direct investment. Now, of that $497 billion worth of foreign direct investment, the startling 96.6% has been for takeovers of businesses in Canada, and a paltry, a puny 3.4% has been for new business investment. And we have, Paul Martin and John Manley and the rest of them going to Davos and going to Manhattan, and Ralph Klein going to Manhattan. And we have an investment division called, what is it called? Partnership Canada. We've got over 50 people around the world now soliciting more of the same. So what they're soliciting is they're soliciting more of the takeover of our country. Well, what are the implications of this? Why would no other country in the world, no country that you can think of, dream of allowing the takeover of their country the way we have in Canada? Well, number one is Harry Arthurs of York University, and Eric Reguly of the Globe Mail has done a good job on this. You get the hollowing out of corporate Canada in Toronto, in Calgary, in Vancouver, and elsewhere across the country. You get West Coast Energy, a wonderful, successful, profitable company in Vancouver, taken over by non-residents. And what happens? Head office is transferred out of Vancouver. You want to stay with that company, you move down to the United States. The data processing is done in the United States, the payroll is done in the United States, the purchasing is done in the United States, the research and development is done in the United States. Tough luck, local flower shop. Tough luck, local travel agency. Tough luck, local symphony orchestra. Tough luck, local hockey team. And the hollowing out of corporate Canada happens. You also get something called transfer pricing. I don't know how many of you know what transfer pricing is, but the past president of the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants recently said to me, Mel, the largest single growth area of accountancy in Canada is now transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is when companies like Coca-Cola Ford, Safeway, the big drug companies charge their Canadian operations so much in management fees and advertising fees and other fees that they transfer the profits right out of Canada before they are taxable. And guess, ladies and gentlemen, who it is in this country that has to make up the lost tax revenue? Of course, it's everyone here in this room. The other thing that happens when you have so much foreign ownership and foreign control is the absence of proper levels of research and development. Canada has among the best incentives of any nation anywhere in the world in terms of research and development, and yet every year we're down in 14th or 15th or 16th place among OECD countries in terms of R&D. And in my book I show the incredible lack of performance in terms of patent production and innovation in this country. Little countries like Norway or New Zealand have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times as many patents produced every year as Canada does, and that is simply one of the characteristics of a branch plant economy. You also get excessive foreign content. Again, in the book I show the foreign content in manufacturing in Great Britain, in the United States, in France, and Germany at levels that are like this. And in good old branch plant colonial Canada, the level of foreign content in manufacturing is up to 50%. Again, a level that no other country would accept. And you know, what does that simply mean? It means levels of unemployment that are far too high. It means inability to do all kinds of things we should be doing if we were a normal country. Well, who is it that has been leading us in the direction that we've been going in? Well, if I had to name one particular group, it is our good old patriotic Canadian banks. And it is our plutocracy, and I'll come back to that word a little later. And it's the C.D. Howe Institute, the Fraser Institute, the Institute for Research and Public Policy in Montreal, the Conference Board of Canada, the Donner Foundation. And you know, one characteristic they all have, except for the fact that many of their policies are very simply anti-Canadian, is that they won't tell you who finances them. Jack Mintz is the head of the C.D. Howe Foundation, which is, I think, one of the worst groups that we've ever had in this country. And Mintz, I phoned him and I said, you know, Mintz, why don't you tell us where you get your money from? And we've been asking this for years and years. Disclose where you get your funding from. And you know what he said to me? He said, Mel, even my board of directors doesn't know where we get all of our money. Well, figure that out. You know, there's been rumors for years that organizations like I've just mentioned have been funded to a very large degree by foreign corporations, by corporations in the United States, not to mention the possibility that they are funded from some of the government agencies. Okay, in the United States. Let's look at what's happening in Canada today. Paul alluded to it in his opening remarks. In my book, I show that, incredibly, only 30% of Canadians say that they are confident that this country is going to survive for the next generation. Now, again, there is no other country, no other Western democracy, maybe a colony somewhere, maybe a developing country somewhere. There is no other Western democracy that you can think of that would have a statistic remotely similar to that. And more recently, 36% of Canadians say that they do not believe that there's going to be a country a generation from now. So the subtitle of my book is called, Is It Too Late to Save Canada? Thanks, Paul. Great Canadian nationalist, Peter Newman, one of the 3 founders of the Committee for an Independent Canada, has told me on 2 occasions recently that he thinks it's now too late for our country. I phoned Suzuki to ask him about something relating to the environment in my book just before I sent it into the publishers, and halfway through my "Hello, David, how are you doing?" Suzuki said to me, Mel, don't mention it. It's already too late. We've already lost the country. So what has happened, as many of us predicted, and universally we were called fearmongers by Mulroney and colleagues. There have been huge changes in Canada since the free trade agreement and since NAFTA came into effect. The process of deregulation, the process of privatization, the process of harmonization, changing employment insurance down to American standards. And you know, here is one of the most important things. And when you hear people, when you read in the Globe and Mail and the National Post and the rest of them, well, we can't afford what Roy Romano is saying. You know, we can't afford a decent healthcare system. We can't afford to buy helicopters for our military. We can't afford to do anything significant about lifting poor children up out of poverty. One of the most important aspects of the Americanization of our country has been the whole attitude of the elite and the plutocracy and the media towards the idea of taxation. Okay, listen to this, because it's important. If we were only a normal OECD country, ladies and gentlemen, there are 30 countries in the OECD, and if we were only an average OECD country, not worse, not better, but right in the middle, we'd be spending an additional $34 billion a year on healthcare, on lifting kids out of poverty, on the military, on all kinds, on education, so that our tuition fees wouldn't be going through the roof. And let me tell you, that $34 billion, while it would be the average of the OECD nations, would not have to come from average Canadians. And again, I mention in great detail where the money would come from. And it wouldn't be the people in this room, I can tell you that. Conrad Black says, Canadians are Canadians by accident. He says Canadians do not have many substantive differences from Americans. He says that, he actually says this, Canadians would welcome a takeover of Canada by the Americans. And I say in response to that, that simply confirms what many of us have believed for quite some time, that there was no brain drain when Conrad Black left Canada. There are many significant differences. There are differences in violence. I've mentioned in the book that 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. Since the end of the Vietnam War, 85,000 American children have been killed by guns in the United States. The poverty levels in the United States, every year when the OECD or the United Nations comes out with them, there is, in the list of 30 countries, there's the United States down there with Mexico and Russia with by far the worst poverty levels. I spoke last week in Washington, D.C., and I said to them, you know, I don't understand you people. Here we are in the nation's capital, and you've got an official child poverty level of 31.1%, and if you used OECD or United Nations standards, it would be over 50%. I said, I don't know how you allow that to happen. And the day I was in Washington, by the way, on the very front page of the Washington Post was a headline, Agency to Provide Medical Care for the Poor in Washington has gone bankrupt. Well, we do better than that in this country. The United States has 41 million Americans with no health care, another 40 million Americans that have totally inadequate health care. And you know, the largest single cause of bankruptcy in the United States is losing your job. The next biggest cause of bankruptcy in the United States is unpaid medical bills. And this year, about 50,000 American families will lose their homes because of unpaid medical bills. Well, I say, phooey on those who say we shouldn't define ourselves on the basis of our differences with the United States. I say that's a heck of a good way to define ourselves. I also say that Canada is a much better country than the United States, and we shouldn't be shy about saying so. One of the major themes in my book has to do with the huge gap between people like you in this room and average Canadians across the country and the plutocracy that has developed, this narrow, powerful, well-financed, very well-organized elite that is now in charge of the Canadian agenda. In poll after poll after poll, it shows what the vast majority of Canadians believe in terms of what our values and standards should be, as opposed to what the Canadian plutocracy believes. Now, who are these people? Some people call them neocons. I don't think it has anything to do whatsoever with conservatism. Certainly not in the tradition of the Conservative Party of Canada, certainly not in the idea of small c conservatism. Some people call them neoliberals. They're not anything to do with the, before Chrétien anyway, the traditions of the Liberal Party of Canada. What they are is the radical right. They're radical because they're proposing an agenda that is totally radical in terms of the 135-year history of our country. And I have to say, and to be very blunt and honest about it, many of them have to be described as anti-Canadians. We have another problem. Along with this group, along with the banks, we have, and this group that many of them, by the way, are disciples of Brian Mulroney's. I made a little list here, and I can't believe how many of them come from Mr. Mulroney's entourage, and they're very active right now. We also have the media in Canada. Now, I get my book has received amazingly soft treatment in the media so far, but it gets trashed today in the Globe and Mail. But I guess I really shouldn't expect any difference when I suggest in my book that the editorial page director of the Globe and Mail get exported to the United States, where I think he belongs. We get the National Post and their nonsense polls. Again, I show in the book how ridiculous some of their front page polls are and how they have absolutely no bearing whatsoever in reality. And we also get the business of Canadians not being properly informed about the increases of foreign ownership. Every year, Statistics Canada comes out with 2 wonderful reports about the growth of foreign ownership and foreign control in this country. There's nothing in the Globe and Mail. There's nothing in the National Post. There's nothing in Asper's Southern newspapers. And I phone Statistics Canada every year and I say, didn't anybody from the press gallery phone you to talk about this? And they say, Mel, they're simply not interested. So what's the agenda today? Well, look, just as we're here in this room today, there's a group of people there, they call themselves the Borderlines Conferences. They've had one conference already in Calgary, September the 13th. I was invited down there, and I came away, I must tell you, frightened out of my mind. I've been concerned about Canadian survival and the independence of this country for many, many years, but I'm never more concerned than I am now, especially listening to that group of radicals in Calgary on September the 13th. They just had another conference on November the 1st, I guess it was, in Montreal. They're going to have another conference here in Toronto, and then they're going to have another conference in Washington, D.C. What do they want? They want us to adopt the American dollar. Goodbye control of monetary policy. And when you lose control of monetary policy, you automatically, inevitably lose control of fiscal policy. And when you lose control of fiscal policy and monetary policy, goodbye Canadian social programs. They want to open up the border, abandon the border. So forget the fact that we've stopped almost 10,000 guns at the border in recent years, and forget the violence in American society. Let's welcome the Timothy McVeighs and the Ku Klux Klans and the organized crime in the United States. Let's open up the border. They want, ladies and gentlemen, for us to move into a customs union or a common market. I don't know if the name Richard Lipsey means anything to any of you. When we had the great free trade debates in the 1980s, Richard Lipsey was the #1 pro-free trade guru for the Quino's so-called alliance. And I debated him a couple of times, once at External Affairs and once in Kingston. And he said, in those debates, he said, I'm in favor of free trade, but I definitely would not want a customs union or a common market, because he said that would be the end of Canada. The Macdonald Royal Commission said they were staunchly against any customs union or a common market. I asked Richard Lipsey to expand on this in my book, and he's done so. Donald MacDonald is against a common market, and Paul says I'm running out of time. Okay. The other thing they want to do and boggles my mind, is they want to abandon foreign ownership restrictions in telecommunications, in the cable companies, in the banks, in the airlines, in book publishing, in the bookstores, in newspapers, in television and cable. And oh, by the way, they'd like to junk the CBC. They want to integrate Canada's armed forces with the American armed forces in a perimeter, in Northcom. And won't that be great, ladies and gentlemen, when the next American Vietnam comes along and we have to send our children and our grandchildren off to war. And you know what they're saying, these guys? They're saying over and over again in their speeches, in their comments, in their writings, they say, all of this is, quote, inevitable. All of this is, quote, urgent. All of this is, quote, irreversible. Well, because I've got so little time left, actually, boy, I say I've got 5 to 10. What have you got?
I've got 2 minutes too.
All right, I might go a couple minutes longer. He wants me to leave some time for questions and answers, and I'm definitely going to do that. All right, what have we got to do if we're going to save Canada? Look, is it too late to save Canada? I don't think so either, but I have to tell you, I agree with what Paul said at the beginning. I honestly do believe it's very late in the day. And I think if we're going to let these people get away with what their plans are, then goodbye. I've got 9 grandchildren that I dedicate my book to, and they're not going to grow up to be anything other than tenants in a country that should have been their own. So what do we have to do? Number one, we've got to stop the growth of foreign ownership and foreign control. There's a small problem here. We can't do that because clauses in the Free Trade Agreement and in NAFTA prohibit us from doing that. So rip it up is right. It's got a 6-month abrogation clause. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not a fan of the WTO, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I list a great long list of reasons why we'd be infinitely better off walking away from the FTA and from NAFTA and becoming strong activists, working with countries around the world like Brazil and France and the Scandinavian countries in the WTO. The third thing we've got to do, and Doris alluded to it, and she's been wonderful on this issue, is we have not had a democracy in this country. We have had a strange political system that has nothing whatsoever to do with true democracy. We've got to change from our antiquated first-past-the-post electoral system. We've got to get rid of corporate and trade union donations, which I understand the Chrétien government is actually thinking about it. It will be the biggest single accomplishment of the Chrétien government in their 9 years if they actually go ahead. But I can tell you right now, there's a bunch of Liberal cabinet ministers who are opposed to that idea. We've got to produce complete transparency at every level of politics, at nomination meetings, at constituency meetings, at federal elections, at leadership elections. We've got to produce transparency so we know where the money is coming from. And we've got to stop the patronage, the corruption, the sleaze, the cronyism. Is it any wonder, ladies and gentlemen, that in the last federal election in the age group 18 to 24, only about 39% of the young people voted? We've got to change things so that there are more females in the House of Commons and more females in government. We've got to get rid of the kind of lobbying relationship that Paul Martin has with Earnscliffe and others. And we've got to do a bunch of other things. So who's going to do all of this? I'm coming to the end. Who's going to do all of this? Is it going to be Governor Manley? I refer to him as Governor Manley in my book, and the lawyers from McClellan Street said, "You can't call him Governor Manley." I said, "Oh, yes, I can, because half the people in the caucus call him Governor Manley." I also called Conrad Black Lord Crossover, and the lawyer said, "You can't call him Lord Crossover, that's a sexual reference." And I said, No. If I had called him Lord Crossdresser, that would have been a sexual reference. But anyway, Manley wants to open up the country to foreign ownership. Alan Rock says, quote, "Canadians are ready to accept more foreign ownership," end of quote. Rock doesn't know what he's talking about. All the polls show exactly the opposite. And Paul Martin says, abolishing the border has nothing to do with sovereignty. It's a commercial decision. And when you look at Manley and Pettigrew and Bill Graham, for God's sake, from this city, our minister, what's he, external affairs, foreign affairs? Anyway, Bill Graham says he thinks it would be a good idea if we expanded NAFTA to include social policy, if you can imagine. And Paul Martin's former Deputy Minister of Finance, David Dodge, the head of the Bank of Canada, says we should renegotiate NAFTA to provide for the free flow of labor and capital. Well, free flow of capital means the same thing as opening up the whole country to foreign ownership. And, well, Jean Chrétien's Liberals are the most continentalist and conservative Liberal party in Canadian history, and in more than a few respects, they so strongly resemble Brian Mulroney and friends that it's impossible to tell the difference. Both governments have one fundamental thing in common. They both have almost been totally dominated by the agendas of big business. And, Paul, you'll be pleased to hear, in conclusion, I think that we've got to do something different. We've got to have a new political alignment in this country before it's too late. And I can tell you, sure as in my bottom of my heart, I can tell you that this has got to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we're going to lose our country. We need a new political alignment that will stress Canadian independence, will stress a true egalitarian democracy, and stress preserving Canadian values and social programs. Now is the time for David Orchard and for Maud Barlow and for Paul Hellyer and Duncan Cameron and Jim Stanford and the Green Party and Patrick Boyer and Brian Wilford, the Liberal MP, and Alex Shepherd, the Liberal MP, and Dennis Mills, the Liberal MP. Those are the only three I know that seem to be concerned about the survival of our country, and Murray Dobbin and others to work together for the survival of our country. There is, ladies and gentlemen, one indomitable force that could potentially stop the sellout of Canada. Democracy can be an indomitable force. Poll after poll after poll, year after year after year, show that most Canadians by far oppose the sellout policies of these radical right. Our collective national purpose, ladies and gentlemen, should be to take back our country. A flood of determination can swamp the radical right who are abandoning our country for their own personal gain. What's the big advantage that we have? It's the fact that there are many, many millions more proud Canadians who love our country than there are Americanizers who couldn't care less if Canada survives. This is the last page. I've just come back from a month-long tour across Canada. There isn't a shadow of a doubt in my mind that the overwhelming majority of Canadians love their country, don't want it to disappear, and are searching for somewhere to turn so that they can ensure that their Canada survives as a strong, independent country. The overwhelming majority of Canadians, 3 out of every 4, say that we have a better quality of life than Americans. By a 2-to-1 margin, they say we have a better standard of living and much greater opportunity in this country. Regardless of what the National Post tells you, only 12% of Canadians say we should become more like the United States, while 4 times as many say we should become less like the United States. Yet, incredibly, our sellouts, our Americanizers, our anti-Canadians are taking us in the exact opposite direction. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin today to take the steps to reclaim Canada for Canadians, for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. Canada is a wonderful country. Let's not let our sellout Americanizers take it away from us. Thank you.
Maybe you can use this mic for the conference. Thank you very much, Mel. That was a really smashing presentation. We knew you would start the conference off on a high note, and we were not disappointed. We just hope and pray that your long years of dedication to Canada and your efforts to keep it independent will not be lost on an apathetic public, and the Canadians will rise up and fight to save their country. And we have about 8 minutes for questions. Is anyone lined up in the microphones? And if I could see the mics, I would be able to decide which one should ask the first question. Are you out there, Ian? Can we have enough light to be able to see the...
Well, just to the right, you can recognize people there. Well, both sides.
Is there someone with a mic over here?
Yeah, both sides.
Okay, over here first.
Yes, it's all well and good what Mr. Hurtig has told us about Canada being...
I'm afraid you'll have to speak up, please, for the benefit of those of us who are just a little bit hard of hearing.
Yes. I feel it's all well and good what Mr. Hurtig has addressed us about Canadians being patriotic and not wanting to see Americans take over. But where I live, in Eastern Ontario, we have 11,000 troops at Camp Drum who can be in Ottawa in half an hour. You know, if things don't go the way the Americans want, like things have gone in Iraq, they can be over here and have Ottawa in minutes. How do you address that?
Is this mic working? Okay. How would I address it is very simple. Absolutely foolish to fear Americans. We are a very strong, independent country. We are not in Iraq. We're not in Afghanistan. There's no darn way that the Americans would ever lose the entire respect of the world community if they ever took aggressive action against Canada. And one of the things we have to make sure is that they understand that we are a strong, independent country and we won't stand for any intimidation of any kind.
Okay.
If we identify Canada through hatred, as you say, then aren't we just as bad as the barbarians in the Middle East who burned the American flag?
Look, as I said in Washington, there's very little anti-Americanism in Canada. There's a huge difference between being anti-American and in favor of your own country. And it's very, very important to make that distinction. Now, having said that, during the Richard Nixon and during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of anti-Americanism in this country, and I think it was very well justified. And also, as I said in Washington last week, there's no question that since the election of George W. Bush, there has been an increase of anti-Americanism in this country. I cannot think of any recent American president that has been more inimical to Canadian interests, more hostile to Canadian interests than George W. Bush. I don't like his policies, I don't like his aggressiveness, I don't like his belligerence, I don't like his unilateralism, and no, there's a big difference between people who burn the American flag. What we do pardon me if I use a crude reference, but if you have bad breath, it might be a good thing if your best friend comes along and tells you that your breath isn't that great and you better do something about it. The same thing applies with Canadians. We shouldn't hesitate in telling Americans that we think they're dead wrong in the Landmines Treaty. They're dead wrong in the International Criminal Court. They're dead wrong in rejecting the Small Arms Treaty. They're dead wrong in planning to weaponize outer space, et cetera, et cetera. One of the best things your best friends can do is tell you things like that.
Over here.
Mr. Hurtig, in regard to your reference to Davos, it's in Switzerland if I'm correct. What is the significance, please?
Well, that's where they have the World Economic Forum every year, although last year they had it in Manhattan for some reason. That's where the world's economic elite get together and plan our destiny. And that's where Canadians go and participate in that. Paul knows more about it than I do, actually. Do you want to quickly answer that? No? Okay.
You're doing well.
But it is where the elite get together and see if they can gain more control over the destiny of the citizens of this world.
It's the Old Boys Club. There's someone with the mic at the back here next, and this is the Citizens Club.
This mic.
Yes.
This
ahead.
mic? I grew up in the Depression, lived in a township that went into receivership, went through a horrible time, but a very inspiring time of the people in the community. I would like to bring our minds to that again, with massive unemployment in the United States, massive unemployment coming here in the prairies, et cetera, et cetera. I also want a health plan. So I want us to go back to what happened also in the Great Depression. Canada instituted a Canada Bank, a Bank of Canada, and it loaned to legitimate, democratic, organized, I haven't probably got the right words, but bodies that had the power to levy taxes, to apply to get their loans for essential structures in the community at 1% loan through the Bank of Canada. They didn't go through the Royal Bank, the Montreal Bank, this bank, that bank, who charged a premium on it. We got it directly from ourselves, from the Canadian government, because we were legit bodies trying to pull us out of the Depression. I would like us to do that again now. Not just for that, but put the money in there to create Canadian dollars and put all the profits to us, if there are any profits, coming from the people who want to make a profit in private business. They can come entrepreneurial. We put all the benefit to us through the health plan.
Would you get to the question? Pardon me, would you get to the question, please? We've only got about 2 minutes left.
I just said the question. I want us to do that. How do we do it? How do we get the health plan completely covered by all legitimate bodies, not buying money to finance them through the banks, but through
Okay,
the
I'll
Bank of
answer
Canada?
that. If you're referring specifically to health, I go back to what I said before. Let's please just be a normal nation. You know, let's stop focusing on what they do in the United States, which is what our radical right wants us to do. If we were a normal nation, there'd be no problem funding all of Roy Romano's suggestions and going on to expand it. I think drug coverage should be expanded for poor children, for example. But the answer really lies in our failure to properly legislate the activities of Canadian financial institutions. There's no shortage of money in this country. Look, today, I don't have the exact figures in my mind, but they're in the book and they're pretty darn close to it. Canadian banks now have bank loans in the United States of about $187 billion. In Canada, they have bank loans of only $127 billion. I asked Catherine Swift, the head of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, to write a paragraph about what the impact on the activities of our Canadian banks has been on small and medium-sized businesses across this country. And she says, they can't get from our own Canadian banks, they can't get the working capital that they need for equity capital, to expand their activities in this country, to employ Canadians. And of course, when you have so much foreign ownership, the profits leave the country and they don't recirculate here. So if I had the #1 policy priority in financial terms, I would say, for goodness sakes, let's take back control of the Canadian banking system.
Yes.
Final question from the rear mic over here, and please make it short because we're just right on the cusp.
I will, Mr. Hellyer. Mel, earlier at the end of your speech, you were talking about all the forces that we need to unite so that we can get across a consistent message, from progressive liberals to the Greens to David Orcher. You didn't mention the NDP at all. Was that intentional or an oversight?
Well, when I heard the three prime leadership candidates of the NDP say the other day in one of their debates that NAFTA will have to stay and that they wouldn't rip it up, I mean, that just turned me off immediately. When I watched the performance of Ed Broadbent in 1988 during the absolutely crucial election on free trade and how disappointed we were, when I see the decentralizing thrust of the New Politics Initiative, I must say I am dismayed. Now, having said that, I've got tons of great friends in the NDP, and I mentioned 3 of them by name in my closing remarks. They're wonderful people. God, I wish they'd be stronger in economic policy than they have been. They've always been darn good in social policy, but they've been very poor in economic policy. And if you belong to the NDP, then you've got to go to Jack Layton and the rest of them and say, for God's sake, this country is not going to survive unless we rip up NAFTA.
Thanks again, Mel.